All right, Lou, love that album. Hey, Bob Somma.
Hey, Joe, how are you?
Bob Somma's with us today. I'm well. I'm great because you're here. I mean, as a teenager, I would read Fusion magazine, and I'm like thrilled that I'm like Jonathan Richman, like begging to talk to you.
Well, as I said earlier, Jonathan showed up on our doorstep at 14 years of age and insisted he could be a record reviewer. Little did we know that he would become a pop cultural icon.
Absolutely, and he did it at the feet of the master, Lou Reed.
He did. He copied Lou's every gesture. He tried to talk like him, he tried to sing like him, and he tried to play like him, and he was almost as stiff as Lou Reed was in performance.
His biggest hit, Roadrunner, in my eyes, his biggest hit, at least locally, is Sister Ray, kind of, sort of.
Yeah, and of course, Roadrunner has almost been cited as the anthem of the state Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I don't think it's gotten through the legislature just yet.
It should be, too.
Well, it's interesting, Joe. Jonathan has said he doesn't think it should be.
Jonathan is such a clever fellow, too. So Jonathan Richman and I know I'm digressing already, but Jonathan Richman and Ed Hood and the Velvet Underground, there'd be Ed Hood seances.
Yes, what I would call seances. There were gatherings after the Velvet's shows here in Boston, which were typically at the Tea Party, to Ed's tiny apartment in Cambridge. At that time, he either was still a teaching assistant at Harvard or they had thrown him out, one or the other. And he would invite the Velvets, all of whom would show up, including their then manager, Steve Sesnick. Peter Wolf would occasionally show up, and Jonathan would always show up. Ed would serve Chinese food, and we'd bullshit away, getting incredibly stoned till the early hours of the morning. It was great fun, and I must note that it all happened about 40 years ago.
Now, there's a brand new article with John Cale where he actually references Sesnick and how Lou brought him in, and it was Lou's idea.
Yes, Lou came to regret that. I have nothing bad to say against Sesnick, but I do know that Lou and he did have a falling out. I don't know whether they were in litigation or not, but Lou's ambition was to be a national commercial success, and he thought Sesnick could deliver that for him. And the truth of the matter is that there was such a unique sound that they were more likely to be an international success than a national success, and that's what happened.
It is. And I remember getting those albums in New England Music City for like $1.98, the cutouts.
Well, they pumped out 5 studio albums in a 4-year period. I think 67, 68, 69, 70, and 74. 3 of which were incredible. And it was my writing about the first 3 that occasioned a friendship between Lou and me. There weren't a lot of people writing about them, and they were all writing about them as though they were the house band of Andy Warhol's factory, which Lou hated and didn't want done. You may recall that Valerie Solanas shot Warhol in June of '68, and it was at that point that Lou and the Velvet started to break away from the Warhol environment. Came into his own and did some wonderful, wonderful music. One short anecdote, if I may, about Lou. Came to me at the end of one seance at Ed Hood's and said, "Can I come and stay with you and your wife tonight?" I said, "Sure." We lived up on the North Shore on Argilla Road in Ipswich. And Lou and I got mildly messed, and he said he wanted to watch TV. We had a very tiny Sony black and white TV. We were very poor and very young, as was Lou. And we switched it on, and the first thing that appeared was the opening of Fantastic Voyage, a film you may remember in which they miniaturized a submarine and scientists and put them inside the blood vessel of a botched assassination victim. Lou looked at it, recoiled, and said, "This is very disturbing."
Was it, I'm guessing, Jane Fonda or Raquel Welch?
Raquel Welch, exactly. Good memory. Good memory.
Close.
Close, yes.
One or the other. But
Beauties both.
yeah. And
incongruous as scientists, I might add.
But the movie itself was actually a precursor to what would happen today with the films because, miniaturization,
Yes.
inner worlds. And
Well, this freaked people out because they'd never seen anything like it before. And at the end, of course, the submarine came out a tear duct of one of the scientists. Incredible.
Roger Vadim, was it?
That was Jane Fonda's husband, Vadim, I think. No, Rod Taylor.
Rod Taylor,
That's
okay.
who it was.
Interesting. Great memory for you.
Well, I actually watched it recently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, nostalgia.
So while you were doing Fusion, you went to law school?
Well, I became 1968 was an emergent year for Fusion and for me. Fusion, you may recall, started out as a freebie fanzine. And then I wasn't there when Barry institutionalized it, but he did a good job of hiring good people, including Ron Campisi, who was the art director. And they put together a publication that they thought they could charge people for, and they charged 15 cents in 1968, I think it must have been.
More than a comic book.
Yes. You may recall that the sequence of events was Paul Williams did the first official issue of Crawdaddy in February of '66. Wenner and Gleason did the first official issue of Rolling Stone in November of '67, over a year and a half later. Barry came in right on the heels of Rolling Stone, tried to establish Fusion, again, as I said, as a freebie. He also had some competition in John Kreidel. Remember John?
No.
John did a fanzine called Vibrations. And John focused on the local Boston scene, but Barry's ambitions were larger. At the same time, I was writing and living in New York, writing for the Village Voice, the Drama Review, the New York Free Press, Penthouse Magazine, and in a bunch of anthologies. And Barry called me up and said, "Would you like to write for Fusion?" And I said, "Sure." I wrote a couple articles, one about the Bosstown Sound, which became an infamous dissection of a failed marketing venture, and one about the Velvet Underground. And I sensed that there was some... Barry wasn't happy with the editorial direction of the publication. And he asked me if I were willing to consider becoming the editor. And I said no, because that summer, Williams asked me if I would edit 4 issues of Crawdaddy, which I did. But I then came back to Barry and said, "I think I'd like to come up to Cambridge. Are you still interested?" And he said, "Yeah." I went up and talked to the then editors, Bobby Abrams, Roswell Ainger, Walter Heitzman, all the guys who had edited for Barry, and told them that I had an idea about the publication, that we'd all become rich and famous if they followed it. Well, we didn't become rich, we didn't become famous, but we had a lot of fun.
1 out of 3 ain't bad. It's important as a snapshot of the time, too, because you have these emerging magazines.
Yes. Joe, there was an appetite for those magazines. Stone did, what they did brilliantly were 2 things. Number one, they did great reporting. Perfect example is the death of Prince last month. They were on it instantly and did an in-depth article of the guy's entire career, not unlike the New York Times, probably had it already written before his death. The second thing that they did was reporting on current events in the music business. We chose a different path. We chose writing about pop culture and music within the context of pop culture. And there was room for that. Crawdaddy was a much more obscure publication, and it housed people like Sandy Pearlman, who was the manager of, first they were called the Soft White Underbelly, but they became the Blue Oyster Cult, and John Landau, who became Bruce Springsteen's manager, as we know, and Richard Meltzer, who became the Dean of Rock and Roll. So we all had our niche. The commercial success of Rolling Stone far overshadowed than anything that Paul did with Crawdaddy or we did with Fusion, but there was a place and an audience. We had a rabid following. We had, on occasion, would have people call up the magazine and demand that we would retract things we had written about albums that they loved, and we would talk them off the ledge of that, and finally we got yet another fan by explaining why we did what we did. But as you note, there was an incredible appetite for writing about music. I'm not so sure that it exists today, although I still get and read Rolling Stone.
Well, here's something, and I won't say the magazine's name on the air, but last week I conversed with a guy, and there was a major magazine that did albums and singles reviews, so I wanted to know who the reviewers were. He said, "Joe, we don't do it. We're getting too much pressure. The record labels wanted all positive, and they were screaming about not getting 5 stars." And he goes, "We shut down that. And when I tell you the magazine, it's stunning."
Well, they had...
The major weekly, if you get my drift.
I do. Well, one great thing about Barry Glovsky, who was the publisher of Fusion magazine, is that he would field these demands from labels to write favorable reviews of LPs, which they would give to us for free, and which would occasion the purchase of ad space in the magazine, the plasma of the magazine. Without that ad revenues, we'd be out of business. And Barry would stand his ground. He would say to the public, to the labels, "Look, if the record's good, we'll know that and we'll write about it. And if it stinks, we're not going to say it's good." So he never gave any of the editorial side of the magazine a problem in that regard. I'm sure he chafed at times and saw some monies fly out the door that he might have grabbed. But he was a great publisher, in my opinion.
Now, do you remember where Cream magazine fit in?
Well, Cream came out of Detroit, did it not?
Yep.
Cream came on the heels. Well, you asked about my going to law school. I think I got out of law school in 1976, and by that time, Cream had established itself. What was great about it was it had a verve, a liveliness to it, pushing the envelope that found yet another niche in the market. I'm not sure there's anything like any of those four magazines left today except Rolling Stone. And Stone does an equally good job at politics as well. They have great political writers.
You read my mind, and as a teenager, I was a little incensed, as other fans were, they were going
They
political.
didn't want them to do that, but Wenner stood his ground. And I think it's they get brilliant writers who write tremendous pieces, including investigative journalism type pieces. And my guess is that not more than 5% of their circulation reads the political stuff. But it still is influential in the culture, definitely. We were influential in this respect. I remember this is kind of a joke. Remember Arthur Lee, Forever Changes?
Oh, yeah.
Of course. Okay. Arthur, the Beatles, and David Bowie, in the Beatles' case, it was some compilation, not a new piece, but put out new LPs 1 month. They came on our doorstep, and we chose to write a cover story about who? Arthur Lee. His was the best album. And a little esoteric, but our crowd, our fans, loved that about us.
Arthur Lee and Love had Jimi Hendrix on the track.
They did.
Fun stuff.
Yes. Lee never achieved the commercial success that he wanted, did succeed on Broadway, and I think has passed on in the last 5 years.
I believe he has. As has Alvin Lee. People
Yes,
think of Alvin and
yes,
Arthur.
Yes, yes.
This is all fascinating stuff. How did you meet Barry?
As I say, I had it was a confluence of Fusion under his guidance was emerging in Boston as a leading publication, and I was gaining a reputation in New York.
Right, you went through this.
Yeah,
Sorry.
he had some editorial issues.
Right.
He asked me if I'd come up. 6 months later, I did.
And you were there for the duration, I guess.
We lived together I became the editor, I think, in summer of '69 and lasted till the summer of '74, which took me through the first year of law school. And then I went to Barry and I said, look, Barry, the oomph of the publication is gone. I've tried my best. You've tried your best. We've already made a mark. Let's just throw in the towel. And we did.
Velvet Underground, favorite show that you saw when they played here?
You mean singling them out from the many that I saw?
Yeah. Or you just saw them so frequently?
Oh, I saw them constantly. I think I would say I spent, not consecutively, but I spent a month or two with them in 1968. The show that I do remember, which you might remember, was at the Tea Party when Van Morrison introduced Astral Weeks, played it for the first time.
I was too young.
Too young for that. Okay, fair enough. And it was long recognized as a work of genius, which it is. But the audience there had come to hear, of course, Brown Eyed Girl, and they didn't. And he was resolute in ignoring the audience's demands and played Astral Weeks from beginning to end, and I thought it was brilliant, and we wrote about it. He was one of the more difficult of the rock stars to deal with. He would ask us when we went to interview him, you guys play a musical instrument? We'd say, no. You guys sing? No. You write music? No. He said, what the hell am I talking to you for?
Do you want a Van Morrison story?
Sure.
All right, so I used to represent the late Jimmy Miller, Exile on
Yes.
Main Street.
Yeah, I know.
So he goes, Joe, I got a call from management, and they wanted me to meet Van Morrison. So I go to the airplane. He goes, the roadie comes out with 2 suitcases, and I help him with the suitcases. He goes, a short, balding guy, and I go, when do I meet Van?
You got him.
He goes, it was all downhill from there. Van wouldn't work with him.
I once wrote about him and said that he reminded me of a neighborhood grocer stuck in the meat aisle of. Boy, he hated that. But he was a very difficult guy to deal with. And still is, I'm told. I haven't seen him in many, many years.
Well, to not recognize him and to be,
Yeah.
that must have been a real jolt to him. I guess there's a Them box set out that NPR's been doing something on.
Recently. I
Yeah.
haven't seen it myself, but recently.
So he didn't play Gloria either, I take it?
No, he didn't. He played songs that, for the most part, didn't get heard for the next 30 years. Or much. He never played them in concert on their own. They were too long and complicated, and he needed a little melodic jazz band to play it, which is what the band was that he had for that. But many people recognized it for what it was. He would not promote it. He got, as you know, involved in contract hassles that took him a while to get out of. An unhappy and unpleasant fellow is what I concluded years ago. God, I don't know what he's like now.
There was an article, either Mercury or Warner Brothers had dropped him, and like Rolling Stone was appalled that they dropped Van Morrison.
Yeah, well,
But-
they want you to make money. They don't care what's on there. And I can understand how in the pop culture you have for-profit institutions and they're taking artistic efforts and endeavors and packaging them to sell, to make money. The musicians must know that going in, that that's the world that they have to live in. It's one of the reasons I stopped, I became a lawyer rather than continuing in the music business. It was really hold your nose.
Which was my next question. You're
Yeah.
doing law now. Do you ever think back to the times, and do you ever write?
I don't write. I've been asked to, but I haven't. I recall reading a piece by Robert Christgau, who for years had been the writer at the Village Voice. And in the piece he said, "Whatever happened to Bob Somma?" And I called him up and I said, "Bob, I'm practicing law here in Boston." No, I think we did a line of books called Fusion Books. Peter Goralnik wrote one. There was No One Waved Goodbye, which I edited. And there was the History of Comics in America by Les Daniels, 3 books that were published out of New York. And when I observed how the lawyers approached the negotiations over that book line for Fusion with E.P. Dutton, I said to myself, these guys have expensive suits, boss haircuts, look like $1 million. We're there a bunch of scruffy-looking guys from a little magazine in Boston. They were very good lawyers, by the way. I said, I can do that, and it looks like it might be fun. So I decided to do that, and I've been practicing since 1976.
Now, what you did for me with No One Waved Goodbye, which I bought right away.
Yeah.
I'm reading it. I'm reading Fallen Knights and Fallen Ladies.
Lou's piece,
And I'm saying, Lou Reed is a brilliant writer.
he was.
So as a fan of the Velvet Underground,
Yeah.
teenager picking up the cutout, so it was after the fact. You were into them before I got into them. I was first exposed to them by Lillian Roxon.
Oh, I remember Lou, suffocated to death in her apartment.
Is that what happened to her?
Yeah. She was in the book.
She was my inspiration. She had written the Rock Encyclopedia.
Correct. She was great.
And that's where I read about the Velvet Underground. I have to get these records because of her.
How old were you then, Jeff, I may ask?
I was
Teenager?
15, 1969.
My goodness. And yet you were able, despite your youth, maybe because of your youth, able to absorb all the vibes from that era.
Well, I had that as a book, and my oldest sister, I told my father this yesterday. I flew down to Florida yesterday, saw Mom and Dad. And we were talking, I said, my late sister Sandy, we lost her in '87, but she was my main inspiration as like a writer because she'd come home from the Tea Party. So I would hear it secondhand from or firsthand from my sister,
Yeah.
Sly and the Family Stone, and she got me all excited, and she introduced me to a lot of music, and I later introduced her to music. I played Layla for her when they released it as a single and it bombed.
Derek and the Dominoes.
I bought it and we were playing it in her room to our friends and stuff, and then we all loved it and it became a hit a second time around.
It's the greatest rock symphony ever written. Wonderful.
But it was the 45 without the
Without what's his name's finale?
Atlantic first released
that was the best part of it.
truncated version which didn't hit.
Yeah.
But I had it, and my sister would turn me on to the Animals and all sorts of stuff. So I had this great knowledge from my sister 3 years older than me. And then I'd be buying Fusion and
Well, everything, if you look back, the musicians were more accessible. The writing was easier to understand. The field wasn't crowded. It was kind of a golden era right off the bat. If you were interested in music, live, performance or on records. And that's what I carried with me for the last 76, 24, and 16 is 40 years. I still listen to current music, but like most baby boomers, I'm kind of stuck in my own era. I was thinking the other day that I can think of 4 songs that have similar titles that span 3 decades. These Days, which was recorded by Nico before Jackson Browne did his version song he wrote. These Are Days by 10,000 Maniacs. These Are The Days by Van Morrison on, I think it was on Avalon Sunset. And I've Loved These Days by Billy Joel from Turnstiles. That encompasses the era of music that I think was its height.
No Mary Hopkins.
No.
Okay, we play Mary Hopkins, but that's all right. What we would love
her
to see...
version of These Days.
Those were the days, my friends.
Oh, of course.
Paul McCartney.
Of course. The one of the few people they signed to Apple Records.
Chris Hodge, We're on Our Way. Remember that on Apple?
I do.
It was a great boutique label because it became collectible. The Beatles touched it.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, what we'd love here at Boston Free Radio is to have Barry Glovsky and you in to take a Fusion or 2 magazines and play records from the Fusion and discuss that. That might be fun.
Be happy to do so.
That'd be a lot of fun.
Great. Barry and I share a number of things in common, but one of which is if we're invited anywhere, we always show up.
Well, I would talk to you for 2 hours. We're 8 minutes over the mark where you had to leave. If you have to go,
I do.
I'll let you off the hot seat.
Okay. Well, how about a couple more minutes?
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Sure.
Yeah. So, you like the law?
I do. I didn't have the talent of a musician or a singer, but a lot of lawyers are hams, and I spent a lot of time in court, and it was a lot of fun. It's a performance of sorts. It was also a profession which my education suited me for. That is to say, the Jesuits who educated me would push these blue-collar kids like me into teaching or medicine or law so that they would make a mark, and that's what we did.
Oh, you got this great compliment over the email from Bob Penta from the Department of Revenue.
I remember him.
He had handled 3,000 cases. He said, Bob Somma stuck out, Joe. He goes, great guy. And his client was doing the right thing. And Bob just had high praise for you.
Well, I appreciate that. Give him my best if I'm not able to see him.
He might show up today thinking you're here. So I'll put him on.
Okay.
And he can compliment you on the air. But what a great thing. So do you like being a lawyer better than being a judge?
They were different. They each had their different... I think it depends on the time of the age you are in your career as to what you prefer. Doing rock and roll music as a writer through my early to mid to late 20s was really fun. Being a lawyer for the next 35 years was really fun. Being a judge for the period of time I spent on it was also a great deal of fun. But they were all very different.
Is it like paperwork-wise, a lawyer versus a judge? Is it the same?
No. Could be, but when my kids would ask me, what do you do as a lawyer, I would say, guys, I take paper from this side of my desk and I move it to that side of my desk. So it's paperwork heavy, unless you're in court. What judges do is they have staffs who winnow through all of these papers and they pick up a single piece of paper and say, Judge, this is what you have to decide. You don't have to read all this other stuff. Just decide this one question that's being asked. It's a lot easier to tell you the truth. And you wield considerable influence over people.
I had a dear friend whose father was the great Justice Brown out of New Jersey, and he was the first judge to throw F. Lee Bailey out of a courtroom.
Because of his histrionics?
I don't know what it was, but Jeff just told me, he goes, yeah, my dad was the first judge to throw F. Lee Bailey out.
Well, he was inclined to histrionics, but he was a terrific judge. I mean, terrific lawyer.
Oh, sure.
Lawyer.
Sure. So you've got this wealth of knowledge now from music scene to the law.
I've been asked to write about those 3 years, but I think I'll wait a little bit longer to see how things turn out.
Well, my question to you is, have you written books?
No, I have not. I confine my writing to the writing that a lawyer does. I haven't. I maintain my love of music, and I keep as current as I can on it, although, as I said, I favor the era I came out of. But it's awful time-consuming, being a lawyer, and even being a judge. Less time to devote to other projects.
the important thing that you did with Fusion is, especially in light of the passing of Bowie, Reed,
Yes.
Prince, it's the time capsule, and like when Jesus walked the earth, what, they didn't get the story down till 80 years later, right? Contemporaneous with when it happened, you took a snapshot, really.
Well, I had to fight with our publishers to actually put that work out, which is, if you have a copy of it, it's pretty cheaply done. It's got a beautiful cover, very striking cover, but they didn't spend a hell of a lot of money on it. They said no one will be interested
And no one waved goodbye?
in the deaths of rock and rollers. And I said, you're just wrong about that. People are interested. To this day, in that era's deaths and the more current ones.
And that was the first article, really, where you had Joplin, Hendrix,
All 27.
yeah, and Brian Jones.
Yes,
And you have Lou Reed
yes.
writing the essay, and he would become as famous as them.
Yes. Died 2013, I believe.
I was at his wake.
Were you really?
Yeah, Lou
There must
liked
have
me.
been lots of showing up. People showing up.
Yoko Ono walked by, William Defoe was over there, Paul Simon was on stage. I didn't realize they were friends. Paul did a great Pale Blue Eyes.
Yeah.
Blondie took the night, if you want to go just strictly from performance, with White Light, White Heat. You can find it on YouTube because someone with a camera.
I'll look it up.
Yeah, so it's Lou Reed at the Apollo Theater, December 16th, 2013.
13, yeah.
So Laurie Anderson did it 50 days after Lou died to let the, I guess, Buddhist thing of the spirit leaving the planet 50 days after. It was an amazing show she put together, and it was 3.5 hours.
Wow.
At the
Well, those are
Apollo.
the kind of things that I stayed not in touch with, so I would have loved to have been there. I have great memories of him. He was a fun guy. He never stopped talking about Delmore Schwartz.
I've got the
great-
Delmore Schwartz books because of
You do,
Lou.
isn't it? He was just, I say, Lou, enough already. Talk about something else. When he got into a topic, no matter how at the outside, at the periphery of pop, he would go on and on and on for days about it. He was great fun to talk to.
Did you know his friend Nelson Slater?
No.
Nelson did an album on RCA in '76, produced by Lou Reed, but they went to Syracuse University together.
Yes.
Felix Cavalieri, Ronnie James Dio.
Yes.
Amazing school to have all these
Yes.
legends come out of. And Nelson's a frequent guest on the show. He'll come here from Cleveland, from New York. And Delmore Schwartz, he can go into depth because he and Lou and Delmore.
Students in his class. Yeah. Well, I thought it got a little tedious after 2.5 hours of listening to it. But that's probably one of the reasons Lou and I remained friends, is that I was willing to listen to it. He had a lot of attention early in his career, a long hiatus, and a lot of attention toward the end of his life and his career. I think he got his due. I think he was I think he was a pop genius of sorts,
No doubt.
really. And another one who got recognition throughout his life was David Bowie. Bowie came to Fusion's offices one August dressed in an overcoat.
Really?
Yeah, it was a couple of years before he became internationally famous. But he came to the office and he said, "Would you publish an interview I did of myself?"
Good evening, Winchester. Good evening, everyone on Verizon. It's Visual Radio Live for June 27th, 2013. Tonight, Steve Hunter, guitar player for Alice Cooper, guitar player for Peter Gabriel of Genesis, guitar player for Lou Reed on our show, and Frank Dell'Estrito. So the views and opinions on Visual Radio Live are those of the host, Joe V, and his guests, and not necessarily those of Winchester Community Access and Media, its board of directors, staff, and members. Thank you, Judy Kellerman, for your hard work and your wonderful lighting and audio. And we're going to talk to Mr. Steve Hunter.
Hello.
Hello, Karen.
Hi, is that Joe?
Yes.
Hi, it's me, Karen.
Hi, Karen. Is Steve available?
Oh, he is. Yeah, let me go find him for you.
Thank you very much.
in his studio in his talking chair.
And I'm in my studio.
In your talking chair.
That's correct.
There you go. There you go. Bye.
Bye, Karen. Thank you.
Hello?
Steve Hunter.
Hey.
It's so good to hear your voice, Steve.
Well, thank you. You too, Joe.
Thank you for sending me that wonderful new album.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad you like it. I assume you like it.
I love it. It's
Good.
it's one of the best discs I've heard all year, and I get a lot of records in the mail.
That's wonderful to hear that. Thank you.
I still call them records, Steve. Is that okay?
That's what I call them, too.
You know, they are. They're records,
Yeah?
recordings.
I call them records or albums, you know.
Now, you know, vinyl's coming back. Your record might lend itself to a good vinyl pressing at some point.
Yes, we thought about that when I initially did my Kickstarter campaign. We thought about that. I looked into it. It was a little pricey, but it's still a possibility that somewhere down the line, I would love to have it pressed on vinyl. I really would.
Now, the title, how did you come up with the title? Because did you record it all in Manhattan?
No, it was all recorded in my studio. Part of it was recorded in my studio is just like a home studio, but it's Pro Tools, you know, that kind of thing. I started it when I was living in Nashville, and then I finished it when we moved out here to Phoenix. So it was all recorded here. But the album it's sort of like an old concept album where all the songs have something to do with New York City or my take on New York City and Manhattan and Brooklyn, things like that. So it's an old style concept album.
And I'm old school, so I like it.
Yeah, yeah, I do too. I always like concept albums because it was great to put the album on and listen from start to finish, and you get this sense of a continuity amongst all the songs. And the album seemed to have a flow that other albums don't have quite the same. I mean, it doesn't make them any worse or any better, but just I always kind of liked that. I always kind of liked an album that had a concept.
Now, you're still going around doing sessions and such, so do you fit the album in when I know you work with Alice Cooper on Welcome to My Nightmare.
Right? I did.
And so as you're developing this, do you just put stuff on the shelf, then go and do what you have to do, and then come back to it?
Well, yeah, actually, that's pretty much it. Yeah, you know, you'll have an idea. You might put an idea down, a progression maybe, or a little melody snippet and stuff. That's the wonderful thing about Pro Tools. It's once you've launched it, it's just sitting there waiting on you to hit record. So it does come in handy. And of course, even on my phone, you know, you can record stuff on your phone now. If you have an idea and you're out on the road or out running around or something, you can always throw an idea down. But yeah, that's what I do. I put little sketches away until I get freed up, and then I work on them later.
Interesting. So how did the concept come about? When did the initial idea happen?
Well, a friend of mine is a really great photographer, and she had taken some photographs of Manhattan on one of a beautiful spring day with a clear blue sky a couple of years ago. I think it was 2011, maybe even the early part of the year, the spring part of the year, obviously. And she took a couple of really beautiful photographs of Sunset Park and the skyscrapers, and they were just gorgeous photographs. And she posted them on Facebook, and one of them caught my eye. This beautiful sunset in Central Park. And when I looked at the photograph, I started getting ideas for a song. And as I worked on the song, I thought, wow, this is kind of cool. Maybe I should just write these songs based on photographs. That was my first inclination, was to do it that way. But then I started thinking, no, you know what I should do? I should write my take on New York City, because I've been in and out of Manhattan and New York many, many times over during my career. A lot of times I was there in the 70s. I was there, you know, several times in the year in the 70s doing overdubs and recording and stuff. So I have these memories of New York that might be a little bit different than everybody else's, and I might have a different take on the city itself as opposed to other people. So I thought, well, that's what I'll do. I'll do the sort of the bluesier side of Manhattan. Mostly Manhattan, although there is a song on there called the Brooklyn Shuffle. but it's mostly about Manhattan because that's where I spent most of my time. And it just developed from Sunset and Central Park. The whole thing just developed from that song.
Now, on the Brooklyn Shuffle, which I found distinctly different from the other sounds because it's harder, it's probably the hardest track on the record.
Yes, yeah.
And you've got John...
What I wanted to do was, I'd had all these songs that were fairly serious, you know, and very bluesy and moody, and I wanted to just lighten it up a little bit. And when I think of Brooklyn, I think of crossing the Brooklyn Bridge or whichever bridge you want to cross, and you go into Brooklyn, and Brooklyn just has this wonderful cruising kind of vibe to it. So I thought that's what I need to do. I need to do a shuffle. I need to do a shuffle so that, like when you're riding in a car or in a cab or something, you're going over to Brooklyn, this song could be playing in the background and it would make sense. So, but it had to be sort of a more up thing, and it had to be a little louder, and it had to be a little more in your face, and it had to be a little bit more fun. So I wanted to put one on there like that, and that's where the Brooklyn Shuffle came from.
Now, I did not know Johnny Depp plays guitar.
Oh yeah, he's a great guitar player. When he first came to Los Angeles, he came from Florida with a band. He had a band, and they did some shows around L.A. I used to remember looking at the L.A. Weekly, and I kept seeing this band called The Kids, and I didn't know who it was, and I never got to see him. But I heard years later that it was Johnny Depp's band. And they were trying to get a record deal and trying to get some things going, and nothing seemed to happen. And the next thing you know, Johnny Depp's an incredible actor. But he's still a great guitar player. And so I met him in London. I was out with Alice Cooper. We were 2011. We played a place called the 100 Club, which is an awesome place in London. It's a small club, but a lot of people play there all the time. And I met him. Alice Cooper was working with Johnny on the Dark Shadows movie.
Okay.
Invited him down to play with us, and that's how I met him. And that's when I got up the nerve to ask him if he'd like to play on my record. And he said, "Sure, I'd love to."
Now, I just saw Dark Shadows. It's on HBO now. So I just saw it the other day. That's pretty funny. Are you in the movie?
No. It's just Alice.
Okay.
And, I haven't seen the movie, so I don't know all of the particulars about it. But I used to watch the TV show all the time. It used to be one of my favorite TV shows.
Well, Alice is great, of course. Johnny Depp is great. What I don't like is Timothy Burton takes liberties, and it's almost a parody of Dark Shadows because it doesn't have that whole essence that Barnabas Collins brought to it. And, you know, the original Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, it was so regal back then.
Oh, yeah, Barnabas Collins was the coolest character. He was definitely the coolest.
Now, it's probably his final role because he died right after the movie came out.
Right, yeah.
Barnabas comes in at the party scene with Alice. And Johnny Depp has a great line, "Ugliest woman I've ever seen," for Alice Cooper.
Yeah, oh, great. That's terrific.
Yeah.
I'll have to try to see that. It sounds like my kind of movie.
Well, you know, if you have HBO or on demand, it's on that right now. But so, what did you do in London? If they were filming Dark Shadows in London?
Yeah, I think we had a couple of days off, and actually, I think we had several days off. If I remember right, that tour is a bit of a blur. We went around the world twice, and so it's a little blurry as to exactly what happened. But I think we had a few days off in Sweden, in Stockholm. And while we were off, Alice flew into London and worked on the film, and then we flew from Stockholm back to London to catch up with him to do the 100 Club.
So Alice would do a couple of like smaller clubs for the fun of it.
Well, yeah, but the 100 Club is kind of one of those nostalgic places like the Roxy or the Whiskey or something, that
Sure.
that you sort of just got to play. I mean, I've heard the Stones have played there many times. And it's a tiny club, but there's something cool about it. It's a really cool little club.
Now, when Bob Ezrin did the Mitch Ryder in Detroit album,
Yeah.
that was Bob's first album, I believe.
Yeah, I believe it was. I think at the same time he was working with Jack Richardson on Alice's stuff. But the Detroit album, I think, was the first album that he produced solely himself. He was working with Jack Richardson. They were co-producing the Alice stuff. But the Detroit album, Bob produced that all himself.
Now, where were you before Detroit? How did they find you for the Detroit record?
Yeah, that's kind of a weird thing. I grew up in Decatur, Illinois, and 1970 I got out of the Army and went back to Decatur, of course, and I was in a couple of different bands in Decatur. And I finally got in this band called the Light Brigade. It was a pretty good band, and we were working around the central Illinois and sometimes up north, doing gigs and stuff and playing bars and stuff like that. And a friend of mine, a really good bass player named John Sauter, had gone to Detroit and actually had joined the Mitch Ryder's Detroit band. And he called me up one day and said, Steve, they're looking for guitar players up here, and they're having guys audition, so maybe you ought to come up and try out. It can't hurt. And so I thought, well, yeah, I should. I should go up there and check it out. I was a huge Mitch Ryder fan with the Detroit Wheels, so I thought this would be fun. So I drove all the way up there. It was like an 8-hour drive or something. And it was great because it was the first time I got to plug into a half-stacked Marshall. I'd seen Jimi Hendrix with him, but I never even saw one up close, and finally there was one, and I got to play through it. So I was pretty excited, and we just jammed on kind of cream tunes and stuff. Since I didn't know any of the material, we just jammed on creams and blues and some other rock and roll stuff, and had a great time. And I was just in love with the Marshall amp. It sounded so good. I ended up getting the gig, so now I'm a part of the band, and we start doing pre-production, like working on material, working on songs and stuff, and that's where I met Bob.
Wow. And that relationship has been a 40-year relationship, like?
Well, it's been even more than 40 years now, like 42 years. I think it was 71 when I moved up to Detroit.
Oh, so you moved right to Detroit.
I did. I moved from Decatur to Detroit, yeah.
Now,
once I joined the band, I went ahead and moved up there.
Now, I heard that it was recorded in, like, the Cream magazine offices or something?
No. It wasn't recorded there. We did rehearse there because the building was like this old condemned building, but it had this great big sort of meeting room. I guess they probably used it as a meeting room of some sort. It was huge. So we rehearsed there. We rehearsed in that big room at the Cream building. But it was recorded. Part of it was recorded in Chicago, and the other part was recorded in Toronto.
Oh man, I did not realize this.
Yep. We recorded about half of it in Chicago, and then we were out on the road at the time doing gigs. So when we came off the road, we'd go record. I think we recorded for 2 weeks in Chicago at RCA Studios in Chicago, and then we went to this studio called Manta in Toronto, which was an incredible studio. I think it's still there. It was a really cool studio. So we did about 2 weeks in Toronto at Manta, finishing it up.
So a big underground hit up here in Boston on WNTN in Newton was Rock and Roll, the Lou Reed song.
Right, yeah.
Who came up with that arrangement?
Heard about that. It was my arrangement. I came up with it. Geez, I don't know how I came up with it. I think in the back of my mind I was thinking, how would Leslie West play this song? Because I was a huge fan. And I think about a month before I started working on it, I had gone to see Mountain at the Easttown Theater in Detroit. And they were just phenomenal. It was one of the most phenomenal rock and roll bands I had ever seen. And Leslie West was just a flawless player. So I was a huge fan. So I think somewhere in the back of my mind, I might have been thinking, I wonder how Mountain would do this tune. And this arrangement started coming out. So it was sort of a combination of Mountain and maybe Cream and a little bit of Hendrix. It's all my favorites, influenced how that arrangement came out.
And you do realize that Joan Jett and the Blackhearts and Blue Swede covered your arrangement.
Yes, that's what I'd heard, although I've never heard those arrangements, strangely enough. I did hear that there were a couple of more versions out, and I never got to hear them. And I thought, well, that's funny. I wonder how come they didn't go back and do Lou's version or something. It caught me off guard, but I thought it was very cool. Very cool that happened.
Well, Kim Fowley discovered the Runaways, and I can see Kim, who was big into Cream magazine and rock scene.
Yeah.
And understanding the brilliance of your arrangement, I can understand Kim going with the Runaways. Blue Swede, now that's an oddity.
Yeah, I never would have thought that. It was a cool band, but I never would have thought they'd have even been interested in that. It's cool that they were, though. It's very cool.
There was their third single. They actually did it on the Midnight Special. So if you go into YouTube, I think you can hear their version.
Oh, I got to check that out. I don't think I've ever heard it. That'd be awesome. I'll check that out. Thank you for that.
Being a fan of yours, I of course picked up 45s of this stuff and have them in the cellar somewhere, you know, because it was just it was interesting following the whole progression, the genesis of this, and then how it all expanded. You know, and then of course after Detroit. Well, tell me a little bit more about Detroit. How long did that last?
Well, I wasn't really there. I don't even think I was there for a full year. We were having a lot of trouble getting any help from the label, you know, to help us promote the album and maybe help get us some gigs and get us on the radio and things like that. We were just having a lot of trouble with the label helping us out, which, you know, I think a lot of that sort of happened in those days. The music business was really crazy back then. I mean, it still is, but it was really didn't know what to do a lot of times, you know. So we were really out there busting our butts, you know, trying to do as many shows as we do all over the country and in Canada and everything. But we just couldn't get enough backing from the label, and the band just sort of very slowly, gently fell apart.
Well, Paramount Records.
Gone.
I'm sorry?
I moved back to Decatur and waited on the next thing to happen. You know, I didn't know what I was going to do after that.
You know, Paramount Records, like 20th Century, they had worked hard at making a label, but they were basically film companies, I guess.
Yeah, and I didn't quite understand that because I thought Paramount would understand what needs to be done to make a record. It's the same thing you do for a movie. It's just it's not as much money. It's a lot cheaper to promote an album than it is a film. But I didn't quite understand why they didn't get it, except maybe it was just they didn't get the right people or something. I don't know.
Yeah, but one would think because they have a film company, put one or two of the songs in a movie.
Well, you'd think, yeah.
You know, and put,
think?
you know.
I don't know. I never understood all that. Of course, I was pretty naive then, and I didn't really know that much about the business. I just it's what I could pick up from the peripheral that the album just wasn't being promoted as well as it could have been.
Now, you had colleagues on Paramount Records you might not have ever met called Milkwood. Did you ever hear of them?
No, I've never heard of them.
So Milkwood had an album out on Paramount like in '72, and that was Rick Otkasik, Ben Orzechowski, and Greg Hawkes of The Cars.
Well, no kidding. I didn't know that.
The Cars' very first album was on Paramount under the name Milkwood. I have a copy.
Wow.
I should try to make you a CD of it so you can hear your label mates.
Yeah, that'd be. I didn't know they were there. I mean, that's amazing. That's an amazing thing to hear. I didn't know that.
Well, they're Boston guys basically, but Ben was a friend of mine. I was his personal videographer. I don't know if you know, we lost Ben a few years back.
Yeah, I did hear about that. Yeah.
But in 1998, he had me videotaping his shows because his guitar player was an old dear friend of mine, John Kalishis. So it was very tragic to lose Ben, but I guess he was from Ohio, and I don't know where Rick Ocasek was from, but Greg Hawkes lives here in the Boston area, who was working with Martin Mull. So the keyboard player from The Cars was actually some kind of a string instrument player for Martin Mull.
Wow, that's amazing. It's a weird world, isn't it?
It is. I thought you'd dig some of that history, you know?
Oh, I love that stuff, yeah. I hear stories like that all the time, too, especially in the music business.
So around this time, Lou Reed had a band, a very, very good garage band called the Tots.
Yep.
I really liked them. And then my friend Moogie Klingman replaced the Tots. And Moogie just passed away, but he was a keyboard player with, he worked with Bette Midler and Utopia. He founded the band Utopia with Todd Rundgren.
Todd Rundgren, right.
So Moogie Klingman finished the tour when Lou got tired of the Tots.
Yeah.
And then the Rock and Roll Animal Band. Then you guys started making the tour happen for the Berlin album.
Right, that's right.
So you were in Decatur, and what happened? Did Bob call you up?
Yeah, literally, that's what happened. I was back in Decatur and wondering what the hell I'm going to do now because Detroit had broken up, and I really didn't have a clue what was going to happen next. And then one day the phone rang, and Bob said, "How'd you go to London?" And I said, "Yeah, you know, I'd love to go. I'd never been to London." He said, "Well, we're going to go to London, and we're going to work on the Lou Reed album." He said, but first we're going to fly to Toronto. I'm going to show you some of the songs, give you an idea of what we're going to be doing. And Ainsley Dunbar is going to fly with us, and we're all going to fly over to London. And next thing I know, I'm on an airplane on my way to London.
Ainsley Dunbar, who's on the David Bowie Diamond Dogs record, and he, of course, helped start Journey, I believe.
Yeah, I think he did. Yeah, amazing drummer, one of the most amazing drummers on the planet.
Isn't he?
Oh yeah, no question about it.
So, and then, did you get to play with Jack Bruce?
Oh yeah, I remember. See, that's the weird thing about this album. It was here. It is my first time in London, and I'm freaking. It's like, wow, I'm in London. The Beatles started in Liverpool, and they came down. All this musical history, all my favorite musical bands, the Yardbirds, the Rolling Stones. All these bands are in. This is where they're from, And here I'm so excited. And I don't know how many times I walked into the studio and completely freaked out at the people that I would see in there that I was going to get to play with. There was one day I walked in, it was Ainsley Dunbar, Jack Bruce, and Steve Winwood. And I was like, I thought I'd died and gone to rock and roll heaven. I mean, this is my second album. It's the second album I've ever recorded in my life. And here I am with Jack Bruce and Steve Winwood and Ainsley Dunbar. It was like amazing to me. It was one of the most incredible experiences of my entire career to play with those guys. Later on, Jack Bruce and I got along so well that I ended up doing one of his solo albums, the one called Out of the Storm.
Which I've reviewed on All Music. I forgot about that.
Yeah. So, which was another real thrill for me. The Cream was one of my favorite all-time bands. It was just one of my favorite all-time bands, and here I am playing with the bass player. It was wonderful.
He called my house once, so,
Well, there you go.
Well, I used to manage Jimmy Miller, who produced Blind Faith.
Right, okay.
And here you are with half a Blind Faith on the Lou Reed album with Steve Hunter and Ainsley Dunbar.
Yeah.
So Blind Faith being a supergroup, actually Bob Ezrin put together a whole different supergroup for Berlin.
Yeah, I think that's what he was. I think that was his intent, to put together a special kind of group of people that would get this. Because I know he was looking for a certain vibe on the album, just an overall vibe on the album, to make it unique and tell that story, that incredible story that Lou had written. It's probably one of the most incredible art albums I've ever been involved in. I know it's depressing, and I know it's, when it first came out, nobody wanted to hear this, but I think it's one of the most incredible albums ever done.
It's one of my all-time favorite albums, and I played it into the ground.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it is depressing.
Yeah, it is depressing, but, it's a story, it's just a beautiful piece of art. I was very proud to be on it.
And you really think about it in its context. You had the Velvet Underground. Then you have Lou Reed with this super session creating this entity outside of the Velvets, a whole different bit of work. Even though Carolyn says, I think, might have been a Velvet left over, or there were fragments of the Velvets certainly in his consciousness, but you had a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And then you got Bob Ezrin and Steve Hunter, and Lou had been quoted saying that your version of rock and roll was his favorite Lou Reed cover ever back in the day.
That's what I heard too, and I was completely flattered when I heard that. I wasn't expecting that. That made me feel really good, and I think that's one of the reasons why he tracked us down, why he tracked Bob and I down.
Oh, makes perfect sense now.
Yeah, he really liked that version so much.
So Lou,
I of course was thrilled when I heard that.
Oh, so Lou heard, of course, if you write a song and you hear this fantastic version of it, you want to track down the people who did it. So that is probably the demo that got the deal for the Berlin album for you.
You could look at it like that, yeah.
We play something on my show called The Demo That Got the Deal.
Right.
I've been doing this since 1992. Was Swept Away your first solo record?
Yeah, it was first solo album, yeah.
So what was the demo that got the deal for Swept Away?
Well, you know what? There was no demo. Well, unless you want to count the intro to Sweet Jane, because I think that's what the label. I believe Jerry Greenberg was the president of Atlantic Atco at the time, and I think that he had heard about me and had heard the intro, Sweet Jane, and all that sort of thing. And I think that's really how the deal came around.